You know, child, some nights never leave you. They cling to your bones like frost. They echo in your dreams long after you've tried to bury them, and they remind you of the moments when love turned to betrayal. I was just a girl when my grandpa sold his land in Arizona. $6 million. Can you imagine? Back then, it felt like a fortune so big it could protect our family for generations. Grandpa was a simple man. He wore the same boots for 20 years, carried the same worn leather wallet, and believed a handshake meant more than 1,000 contracts. When he sold that land, he didn't keep it for himself. No, he trusted my father. He said, "Son, this money is not just yours. It's for the family, for the children, for her." And her was me. I didn't know the details back then. All I knew was that Grandpa loved me more than anyone. He'd slip me peppermints from his pocket, tell me stories by the fire, and always say, "If the world turns cold, little bird, my cabin will keep you warm." He was talking about that old wooden cabin in the woods, the one built before I was even born. I never thought those words would save my life. Because when Grandpa passed, things changed. My father, oh, my father, he wore grief like a mask. To the neighbors, he was the heartbroken son, struggling to carry on his father's legacy. But behind closed doors, money burned through him like wildfire. He loved the power it gave him, the control, the way people bowed their heads when he spoke. And I became nothing more than a burden in his eyes. The night it happened, the air was so sharp it cut through my lungs. Frost painted the windows white, and the wind screamed through the trees like a warning. I remember pulling my old wool sweater tighter, thinking maybe we'd sit together by the fire. Maybe he'd tell me stories like Grandpa used to. Maybe I'd still belong in that house. But instead, my father's eyes were colder than the night itself. He didn't yell. He didn't strike me. No, he simply opened the door, the snow swirling at his back, and he said in a voice so calm it still chills me, "Out. Now." I thought it was a cruel joke at first. I laughed nervously, clutching my blanket, waiting for him to shake his head and let me stay. But he didn't. His hand gripped my arm like iron, and with one shove, I was standing barefoot in the snow. The door slammed shut, and for the first time in my life, I realized I had no home. I stumbled into the night, the ground biting into my skin, every breath turning to smoke in the darkness. My father's house, my house, faded behind me, its windows glowing like eyes that refused to see me. I was nothing but a shadow on the snow. Do you know what it feels like, child, to walk with nowhere to go? To feel your fingers stiffen, your body ache, your tears freezing before they can fall? That night, I thought I would die. Truly. Each step grew heavier, each breath shallower, and my mind screamed for warmth, for shelter, for mercy. And then, I remembered Grandpa's words. "If the world turns cold, little bird, my cabin will keep you warm." The cabin. My feet carried me there, as if his spirit was guiding me. Through the forest, past the blackened trees, until at last I saw it. The cabin, old and weathered, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. To anyone else, it was just a forgotten relic. To me, it was salvation. I pushed open the door, and the smell of dust and cedar filled my lungs. The air inside was no warmer, but it felt alive with memory. Grandpa's hat still hung on the wall. His rocking chair still faced the empty hearth. I collapsed onto the wooden floor, shaking, and whispered, "I made it, Grandpa. I made it." But survival wasn't enough. As I searched for wood to start a fire, my eyes caught something I had never noticed before, a trunk. An old, dusty trunk shoved into the corner, its metal latches rusted, its leather straps worn. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. And in that moment, with my hands trembling, I realized maybe Grandpa had left me more than just memories. I didn't know it yet, but inside that trunk was the secret that would change everything, the secret my father never wanted me to see. I still remember that night, as though the frost itself etched it into my bones. The kind of night where the air feels heavy with silence, and even the stars above seem too distant to care. My father's voice was the last sound I heard before the door slammed behind me, his words cutting through the freezing dark like shards of glass.
Go.
You're nothing but a burden. At first, I thought he was bluffing. I stood there on the porch with my thin coat pulled around me, staring at the wooden door as though it would open again and his face would appear, softer this time, remorseful. But no, only silence followed. Silence, and the whistling wind that clawed at my ears. Snowflakes drifted down, not the playful kind children chase in daylight, but heavy, bitter flakes that stung against my cheeks. I hugged myself, my breath puffing out in desperate clouds. I was still so young, too young to understand how permanent rejection could feel. My father had cast me out, and the night was my only companion. For a moment, my legs refused to move. My body was trembling, but it wasn't just the cold, it was disbelief. How could a man who promised my grandfather he'd protect me now abandon me like this? I had no answers, only a growing panic. My toes were already going numb inside my worn shoes, and I knew if I stayed there, I'd freeze. So I started walking. Each step crunched in the snow, a lonely sound that echoed louder than it should have in the dead quiet of the night. The cold bit into me, sinking past skin, past muscle, into marrow. My fingers burned before they went numb, and I wrapped my arms tighter around my chest. The world around me blurred into shades of gray and white. Bare trees reached up like claws, their branches groaning under the weight of snow. The moon gave just enough light for me to see the path ahead, but every shadow felt alive, every gust of wind a whisper that mocked me. I wanted to cry, to scream for someone to come help me, but the sound would have been swallowed by the endless night. As I stumbled forward, I thought of my grandfather. His voice, deep and steady, telling me stories of resilience. "The snow will test you," he once said, "but the test is not to see if you can endure the cold. It's to see if you remember the warmth you carry inside." At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. But now, shivering and alone, I clung to his words as though they were fire. I didn't know where my feet were carrying me. My father's house grew smaller in my memory with each step, replaced by the gnawing fear that I might collapse before finding shelter. My vision blurred. The edges of the world seemed to dim, as though the night itself was trying to swallow me whole. And then there it was, a shape in the distance, a sloping roof half buried under snow, leaning against the line of trees like an old friend too tired to stand tall. My heart gave a desperate lurch. The cabin. My grandfather's cabin. The sight of it felt like seeing him again, waiting with open arms. My legs, weak as they were, carried me faster. The snow clung heavy to my shoes, and I stumbled more than once, but I pushed forward, whispering prayers to no one in particular. "Please, let the door open. Please, let it still stand." When I reached the cabin, I nearly collapsed against its rough wooden wall. The wood was cold beneath my palms, but familiar, like the skin of an old tree I'd climbed 1,000 times as a child. My breath came in ragged bursts as I found the handle, stiff with rust and ice. It resisted at first, but then gave way with a groan, and the door swung inward. The smell hit me first: dust, old timber, and the faint lingering scent of smoke from fires long burned out. Inside, the darkness was thick, but it was safe. Safe from the wind, from the snow, from the rejection that had driven me here. I stepped in and shut the door behind me, leaning against it until the weight of the world eased just a little. The cabin wasn't much. Just one room, its furniture draped in the ghosts of time. A table, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace that hadn't seen a flame in years. The air was stale, but compared to the biting cold outside, it was a sanctuary. I rubbed my hands together, desperate for warmth, though none came. My body trembled violently now, and I knew if I didn't find some way to warm up, the cabin would become my tomb. I scoured the shelves, the cupboards, my breath stirring motes of dust into the air. But the woodpile was empty. No logs, no kindling, just the cold echo of a home once alive with fire. That's when I saw it. In the corner, half hidden beneath an old blanket, sat a trunk. A large, heavy thing, its brass fittings tarnished, its surface scarred by years of use. My heart skipped. I remembered this trunk. It had belonged to my grandfather. He used to keep it locked, warning me never to tamper with it. As a child, I'd imagined it held treasures, maybe old coins, maybe maps, maybe secrets only he could guard. Now, it was my only hope. I dragged it out, coughing as dust rose in thick clouds. My fingers fumbled with the latch, stiff from cold, but after a struggle, it snapped open. The lid creaked as though reluctant to reveal its contents, and I lifted it slowly. My breath caught in my throat. Inside, I expected blankets, maybe firewood, maybe anything that could save me from the cold. But what I saw was something else entirely. Papers. Envelopes, tied with twine. Old photographs, their edges curled and yellowing. Journals, bound in cracked leather. Papers. Envelopes, tied with twine. Old photographs, their edges curled and yellowing. Journals, bound in cracked leather. And there, sitting atop it all, was an envelope marked with my grandfather's handwriting. My chest tightened. His writing, I'd know it anywhere. Bold strokes, steady lines, the kind of script that spoke of a man who never wavered. I reached for it with trembling hands, my fingers brushing the rough paper. It wasn't just any letter. It was addressed to me, to my granddaughter. The room seemed to fall away. The cold, the hunger, the fear, all of it dulled under the weight of that envelope. My grandfather, gone all these years, had left something for me. Something hidden, something my father clearly hadn't wanted me to find. I clutched it to my chest, my mind spinning. Questions crashed through me like thunder. Why had it been hidden? What could be inside? Why had my father never told me? I wasn't ready to open it, not yet. My fingers itched with curiosity, but I knew the truth inside would change everything. And in that moment, shivering in the dark, I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face it. So I sat there on the cabin floor, the envelope pressed against my heart as the storm raged outside. The fire I longed for was nowhere to be found, but in my hands I held a different kind of warmth, a flicker of hope. My grandfather had left me something, and whatever secret it carried, I knew it was meant for me. Not my father, not anyone else. And that knowledge alone kept me alive through the night. Morning crept into the cabin slowly, a pale light slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls. I woke shivering, my body stiff from the cold floor, the envelope still clutched in my hands as though I'd guarded it even in my sleep. For a long time, I simply stared at it, tracing my grandfather's handwriting with numb fingers. To my granddaughter. The words burned brighter than any fire could have. They were proof that he had thought of me, even beyond death. Proof that I mattered to him, that I wasn't the burden my father said I was. But with that proof came fear. What truth lay hidden inside? Why had this been buried in a trunk instead of shared with me while he was alive? I held my breath and slid a finger beneath the flap. The paper tore softly, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of the cabin. My hands shook as I pulled out a stack of pages, folded neatly. The ink faded, but still strong. The first page began simply. My dearest granddaughter, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you are old enough to know the truth I could not share before. My eyes blurred as I read the words. His voice seemed to rise off the page, deep and steady, echoing in the corners of my memory. Each sentence carried weight, as though he had poured his soul into these lines. He wrote of the land, the Arizona land he had sold, the $6 million he entrusted to my father. He explained that the money had not been meant for my father alone. It was meant for me, for my future, for my protection. My father had been entrusted not as the owner, but as the guardian, tasked with ensuring that I would be cared for, educated, and supported no matter what life brought. But my grandfather had suspected something. I know your father, and though I love him as my son, I fear his heart is too easily swayed by greed. That is why I have written this will in secret. You must understand, child, that the land, the money, the legacy, it is yours. It always was. And if he fails you, this letter is your proof. My heart pounded as I read those words. Proof. Proof that my father had lied, that he had stolen what wasn't his, that he had abandoned not just me, but my grandfather's wishes. I could barely breathe. The cabin walls seemed to close in as the truth washed over me in waves. The letter continued, warning me that there would be resistance, that my father would deny it, that others might try to twist the truth. But tucked within the stack of pages were more documents, legal papers, land deeds, and finally, a signed will, dated and witnessed. And there, in black and white, was the declaration. I was the rightful heir. Tears spilled down my face, hot against my frozen skin. I pressed the papers to my chest, rocking back and forth as though I could feel my grandfather's arms around me again. He hadn't abandoned me. He had fought for me, even beyond his last breath. But the realization cut deeper than comfort. It burned with betrayal. My father had known. He had known and kept it hidden, stealing everything for himself while leaving me to shiver in the snow. He hadn't just abandoned me that night. He had been abandoning me for years, every time he pocketed money that was meant for my care. The anger rose like fire in my chest, warming me more than the thin sunlight seeping into the room. I clenched my fists, the papers crinkling in my grip. All those times I had trusted him, all the tears I had shed, all the prayers for his approval, it had all been for nothing. I felt a resolve forming in me, stronger than the storm outside. I would not stay silent. I would not be the forgotten child cast aside in the snow. I had the truth now, and with it, the power to reclaim what was mine. But beneath the anger, there was something else too, fear. Fear of what would come when I confronted him. Fear of what he might do to silence me. I thought of my grandfather's words again. The snow will test you, but the test is not to see if you can endure the cold. It's to see if you remember the warmth you carry inside. I wiped my tears and folded the will back into the envelope. My fingers were steady now, my heart no longer trembling. The warmth I carried inside wasn't just hope, it was fire. Fire to stand, to fight, to make sure my grandfather's trust wasn't wasted. I rose to my feet, the cabin groaning around me as though it, too, knew the burden I now carried. The path ahead would not be easy. But I was no longer the girl cast out into the snow. I was the heir my grandfather had chosen, the keeper of his legacy. And I would make sure the world knew it. I carried the envelope with me like it was a living thing, tucked close to my chest, as though the cold wind might try to snatch it away. Leaving the cabin that morning, I felt different than when I had arrived the night before. I had walked in broken, abandoned, and small. I walked out with a fire in my belly, a secret in my pocket, and a mission carved into my bones. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way back toward town. Each step felt heavier, not because of the cold, but because of the weight of the truth I carried. My father's betrayal was no longer a suspicion, no longer whispers in my mind. It was written down in my grandfather's hand, signed and sealed with love. When I finally reached home, the house looked different. The same peeling paint, the same sagging porch, but now I saw it for what it really was, a monument to my father's greed. This house should have been a place of comfort, a place my grandfather's gift could have made warm and safe. Instead, it was a prison of lies. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. My father sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand though the sun was barely up. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. "Well, look who decided to crawl back," he sneered. "Thought you'd freeze out there." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I laid the envelope down on the table between us. His gaze flicked to it, then back to me, suspicion flashing across his face. "What's that?" he asked, his voice sharp. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "It's from Grandpa. From the trunk in his cabin." His hand tightened around the glass, the ice clinking against the sides. "You had no right to go snooping in his things. He left it for me," I said firmly, my voice stronger than I felt. "This," I tapped the envelope, "is proof that everything you've been telling me is a lie. The land, the money, the promises, Grandpa left it all for me. Not you." The room fell silent. My father's face went pale, then red, his jaw tightening until I thought it might crack. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "That money was mine. He gave it to me." "No," I shot back, pulling the will from the envelope and laying it open on the table. The faded ink seemed to burn brighter in the light of the kitchen. "He entrusted it to you. For me. You weren't the heir. You were the guardian. And you failed." For a moment, my father said nothing. His eyes darted over the paper, reading the words he had tried to bury all these years. His hand shook slightly, and for the first time, I saw something in him I had never seen before: fear. Then, just as quickly, it turned to rage. "You ungrateful brat," he roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The glass tipped, spilling whiskey across the wood. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? You'd rather believe some dead man's scribbles than your own father?" I stood my ground, though my knees trembled beneath me. "Grandpa didn't lie. You did. You let me suffer while you lived off money that was meant to protect me. You threw me out in the snow while holding $6 million in your hands. You betrayed him, and you betrayed me." His eyes blazed, veins standing out on his temples. "That money was mine to do with as I pleased. I earned it by standing by him all those years, working his land, following his orders. You think he was some saint? You don't know the half of it." "Maybe I don't," I said quietly, "but I know he loved me. And I know you don't. That's the only half that matters." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on us both. He looked at me like I was a stranger, like the daughter he'd controlled for so long had slipped through his fingers overnight. And maybe she had. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a cold smile curling his lips. "So what now? You think a few pieces of paper make you powerful? You think anyone will believe you over me? You're nothing without me. You always have been." His words stung, but not like they used to, because now I had proof. Now, I had something stronger than his voice echoing in my ears. "I'm not nothing," I said, my voice steady. "Not anymore. Grandpa made sure of that. And whether you like it or not, this is over. You don't get to decide my worth. Not anymore." I gathered the papers and tucked them back into the envelope. His eyes followed every movement, his face twisted with anger he couldn't unleash. "Not yet." As I turned to leave, his voice cut through the silence, one last time. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Mark my words, girl, you'll regret it." I paused at the doorway, my back to him. "Maybe," I whispered. "But at least this time, the choice will be mine." And with that, I stepped out into the cold, the envelope clutched to my chest, my breath rising in clouds that seemed to carry away the last of my fear. The world outside was still frozen, but inside, I burned with purpose. I had confronted the man who had cast me aside, and though the battle wasn't over, I had won the first strike. The truth was mine now, and with it, the strength to fight for the life my grandfather had wanted me to have. I didn't know what would come next: the courts, the lawyers, the endless struggle to reclaim what was rightfully mine. But I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer the child abandoned in the snow. I was the heir, the survivor, the one who had risen from the frost with fire in her veins. And I was ready for war. The morning after my confrontation with my father, I woke with the envelope still clutched to my chest. My body ached from the cold and the exhaustion, but my mind felt sharper than it ever had. For the first time in years, I had something stronger than fear. I had truth. But truth, I soon realized, is not always enough. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rented room, the will spread out in front of me. Grandpa's handwriting, though faded, was steady and clear. His words gave me power, but they also laid a burden on my shoulders. It wasn't enough to know the secret. I had to act on it. The question was, how? My father wasn't the kind of man to back down quietly. He had lived his whole life taking what wasn't his, twisting words, manipulating people until they believed his lies. I knew that if I didn't move carefully, he'd find a way to destroy me, or destroy the will, before I could do anything with it. That morning, I made my first decision. I needed help. I walked into town, my boots crunching in the snow, the weight of the envelope tucked deep in my coat. The local library was small, barely more than a single room, but it had something my father didn't expect: resources. I pulled every book I could find on wills, inheritances, and property rights. The librarian, a kind woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, noticed the pile I carried to the table. "You're planning a lawsuit?" she asked softly. I hesitated. My instinct was to keep everything secret, but something in her gaze told me she could be trusted. "Something like that," I said. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Good. Men like him don't win forever. Not when the truth is on your side." Her words gave me courage. I studied until my eyes burned, copying notes by hand, learning what I could about legal guardianship and inheritance disputes. The more I read, the more I realized that Grandpa had given me more than love. He had given me a weapon. That will was airtight. It clearly stated that the land and the fortune were meant for me, with my father only as a temporary custodian until I came of age. And my father had failed that duty spectacularly. The next step was harder. I needed an attorney. Finding one in our small town wasn't easy. Most of the local lawyers were either friends of my father or too timid to take on someone with his reputation. But I wasn't looking for a friend of his. I was looking for someone hungry, someone with fire. I found her in the city, 2 hours away by bus. Her name was Evelyn Sharp, and her reputation matched it. She was young compared to most lawyers, but already known for taking on cases no one else dared touch. When I sat across from her in her office, clutching the envelope like a lifeline, I half expected her to laugh at me. Instead, she listened. Really listened. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "So your grandfather's estate, $6 million worth of land and assets, was supposed to pass to you, and your father concealed the will?" I nodded. "He told me Grandpa left it all to him. He used the money for himself. And when I questioned him, he threw me out into the snow." Her jaw tightened at that, her pen tapping against the desk. "Do you have the document?" With trembling hands, I slid the will across the desk. She read it carefully, lips moving silently as she traced each line. When she looked up, her eyes gleamed. "This," she said, "is gold. Your father doesn't stand a chance if this holds up in court. And from what I see, it's rock solid." My breath caught in my throat. For the first time, the possibility of winning felt real. But Evelyn didn't sugarcoat the road ahead. "Your father won't take this lying down. He'll fight. He'll lie. He'll drag your name through the mud, if he has to. Are you ready for that?" I thought of the snow that had bitten into my skin, the cold that had wrapped around me like death, and the look in my father's eyes when he told me I was nothing. I nodded. "I'm ready." The battle began almost immediately. Within days, Evelyn filed the case in court. My father was served the papers at home, and the news spread through town like wildfire. People who had once whispered about his wealth now whispered about his deceit. He didn't take it well. The night after he was served, he stormed into my rented room, slamming the door so hard it rattled the walls. "You think you can ruin me?" he snarled, his face twisted with rage. "You think some little lawyer and a piece of paper can take me down?" I stood my ground, though my hands shook. "It's not just paper. It's Grandpa's will. And the law is on my side. The law. He spat the word like poison. The law doesn't care about you. It cares about who has the money, the power, the influence. And that's me. You'll see. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Because while he was busy shouting, I was busy preparing. Evelyn helped me gather every scrap of evidence. Letters from Grandpa, witnesses who had known his intentions, even neighbors who remembered Grandpa saying the land was meant for me. Piece by piece, we built a wall of truth that my father couldn't knock down. The courtroom became our battlefield. I'll never forget the first day of trial. The wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of curious neighbors. The judge sat high above, stern and silent. My father entered with his lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, his eyes full of contempt as they swept over me. But when Evelyn stood beside me, papers in hand, I felt steady. My father's lawyer tried everything. He painted me as ungrateful, as unstable, as a child too naive to handle such a fortune. He claimed Grandpa had changed his mind, that the will was outdated, that the money had always been meant for my father. But then Evelyn presented the truth. She laid out the will, Grandpa's own words in ink that could not be denied. She called witnesses who testified to his intentions. She painted the picture of a man who loved his granddaughter deeply and of a son who had twisted that love into greed. And when I took the stand, I told my story. I spoke of the night my father cast me into the snow, of the cold that nearly swallowed me whole, of the trunk in the cabin and the envelope inside. My voice trembled, but I did not falter. Every word was a blade, cutting through the lies my father had woven for years. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Even the judge seemed to pause longer than usual before speaking. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in my father's eyes. His mask was slipping, and he knew it. The trial dragged on for weeks. Every day, a new battle. There were moments when I thought I couldn't go on, when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. But then I would touch the envelope in my pocket, feel the paper worn soft from my hands, and remember why I was fighting. I wasn't just fighting for the money. I was fighting for Grandpa's memory, for the love he had left behind, for the child I had been, shivering in the snow, waiting for someone to care. And slowly, the tide began to turn. By the final day of the trial, even my father's lawyer seemed weary, his arguments frayed and hollow. Evelyn stood tall, her voice strong as she delivered her closing statement. This case is not about greed. It is about betrayal. A man betrayed his father's trust and his daughter's future. But today, we have the chance to set that right, to honor a promise written in love, and to ensure that justice is finally done. The judge's gavel came down like thunder. I held my breath as the verdict was read. And when the words reached my ears, that the court recognized the will as valid, that the inheritance was mine, I felt something inside me break free. Relief. Vindication. Justice. My father's face twisted with fury, but it no longer mattered. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living under his shadow. I was free, but freedom came with its own weight. $6 million was more than I could comprehend, and the land carried memories of both love and pain. I knew the battle wasn't truly over. Not yet. There would be consequences, both seen and unseen. Still, as I walked out of that courtroom with Evelyn by my side and Grandpa's will in my hands, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. And hope, I realized, was worth more than all the money in the world. When the judge's gavel fell that final time, and the verdict was spoken aloud, I thought the storm had ended. I thought that walking out of that courtroom with the will secured and the truth recognized meant the battle was over. But life has a way of reminding you that battles don't end neatly. They leave ripples, scars, and echoes. And those echoes followed me long after the trial. The first night after the verdict, I returned to my little rented room. I sat on the bed in the silence, the envelope beside me, and stared at the wall. I should have felt triumphant, victorious. Instead, I felt hollow. $6 million. It sounded like something from a dream, a figure too large for my hands to hold. But that money wasn't just wealth. It was proof of my grandfather's love, and proof of my father's betrayal. Both realities pressed against me so heavily that I could hardly breathe. I didn't celebrate. I didn't open champagne or shout with joy. I simply sat there, clutching the paper that had saved me, and let the weight of everything sink in. And then, slowly, something else rose inside me. A question: what now? Money changes people. I had seen it with my father. How greed had consumed him, how it had twisted his soul. I didn't want to become him. I didn't want Grandpa's gift to be poisoned in my hands. So I promised myself, right there in that tiny rented room, that I would use the inheritance differently. Not for selfishness, not for vanity, but for healing. The next morning, I returned to the cabin. The snow had begun to thaw, leaving muddy patches of earth and rivulets of water trickling down the slope. The cabin stood as it always had, weathered, quiet, yet strong. Stepping inside, I felt the air settle around me, as though Grandpa himself was welcoming me back. The trunk still sat in the corner, its lid now resting open, its secrets revealed. I touched its wooden edge gently, whispering, "Thank you, Grandpa." That cabin had saved my life. It had held the will that changed my destiny. And I knew then what I had to do: restore it. Not just as a building, but as a place of memory, of safety, of love. I hired local craftsmen, people who remembered my grandfather and respected his legacy. Together, we mended the roof, patched the walls, sanded the floors, and breathed life back into the old wood. I refused to modernize it too much. I wanted it to stay authentic, true to what Grandpa had left behind. By spring, the cabin looked less like a relic and more like a home, and it became my sanctuary. But rebuilding the cabin was only the beginning. The money gave me power, yes, but it also gave me choices. And choices, I realized, were the greatest gift of all. The first choice I made was to invest in myself. For years, my father had told me I was worthless, incapable, destined for nothing. I carried his voice in my head like chains. But now I wanted to silence it. So I enrolled in classes. Literature, history, even a few courses in business and law, areas I had once thought were beyond me. Sitting in a classroom surrounded by people decades younger than me felt strange at first. But with every book I read, every essay I wrote, I felt pieces of myself coming alive that I didn't know existed. One professor, a kind man with glasses perpetually slipping down his nose, pulled me aside one day. "You have a gift for words," he told me. "Have you ever thought of writing?" Writing. The thought stuck in my mind like a seed. I began journaling every night, pouring out memories, feelings, and fragments of stories. Slowly, painfully, the words began to take shape. My pain became paragraphs. My loneliness became chapters. My hope became pages. It was healing in a way I had never known. But as much as I focused on my own growth, I couldn't ignore the presence of my father. Losing the case had shattered him. His pride, his reputation, his illusion of power, all of it lay in ruins. He still lived in town, but whispers followed him wherever he went. People no longer looked at him with respect, but with suspicion, even pity. He tried, of course, to reach out. At first with anger, letters dripping with venom, threats of appeals, accusations that I had ruined his life. Then, later, with desperation, pleas for forgiveness, claims that he was still my father, attempts to guilt me into sharing the inheritance. I read every word, but I never replied. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was out of self-preservation. For years, I had been tangled in his lies, his manipulation, his control. And now I had cut myself free. I wasn't going to tie myself back to the very chains I had broken. The silence between us grew thicker with each passing month. In that silence, I found something I never expected: peace. But peace didn't mean loneliness. As the seasons turned, I began opening the cabin to others. At first, it was just a few friends from my classes.